The Holy Gospel according to Luke.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Now, as they went on their way, Jesus entered a village, and a woman named Mary welcomed him into her house. And she had a sister called Mary, who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to his teaching. But Martha was distracted with much serving. And she went up to him and said, "Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Tell her to help me." But the Lord answered her, "Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled about many things. But one thing is necessary. Mary has chosen the good portion, which will not be taken from her." Here ends the reading. You may be seated. Of all the passages of Scripture that I preach on, I seem to get the most comments about this one because it offends us deeply. How dare Jesus tell someone to stop working? How dare Jesus rescue someone from their anxieties? And yet, maybe that's just because we've internalized something that is not real. Maybe that's because we've internalized the way the world works and we're desperately trying to remake the gospel into the world's image without realizing it. This passage is difficult, and I'll tell you why. Because even I do this passage. And I guarantee you've done this passage too. Running around, constantly trying to make sure everything's perfect, worrying that you might have missed that one thing. I often laugh about it because when I see myself from the outside, looking at what I am doing, seeing how I am rejecting the gospel message, that God promises grace and peace and that eternal shalom, as it were, I have to chuckle. I have to laugh. I think it's important for all of us, and especially pastors, to admit that we need to hear these lessons too. That the gospel message isn't something we preach, but it is something that comes to us, enters our home, causes us to sit down and be present, away from our anxious energy. And I think the jobs of congregations are to listen to that as well, and to understand that this is the central message. That as much as the world wants us to look like Martha, we need to listen to Jesus and be a little bit more like Mary. Now, we've all had those moments. One of the most glaring moments for me is when I will go over and I will visit people, and invariably the person tells me, "I'm sorry for the mess. I'm sorry how messy my house is." And I look around as someone who is the parent of a 4-year-old, and I look around and I realize that this person has nothing to apologize for. But it seems to be on the script the first thing, "Hello, how are you? Sorry for the mess." As one person has put it, nothing motivates a person to clean their house more than knowing that company is coming over. Now imagine that company is Jesus. What will he think of the books and magazines that are lying on your table? instead of on the shelves. The dust bunnies that seem to be starting to propagate around the edges of the house, just out of reach. Or the mail that has been sitting there going unanswered. And what does he think about the problems in your life? The problems that you've left unresolved? The habits that you and I haven't broken quite yet? Or the resolutions that we have left unfulfilled? Spiritual anxiety feels a lot like hosting anxiety, doesn't it? We frantically try to make everything perfect before Jesus arrives, as if he doesn't already see everything, as if he's coming to inspect rather than to love us. This anxiety then causes us to lash out not just against our neighbors, but against Christ himself, our closest friend. We become frustrated when they don't share our panic, angry when they won't help us manage what we think needs managing right now at that moment. We resent their peace when we feel so much pressure in our lives. In our gospel lesson today, we find ourselves getting indignant. Indignant at Mary, and yes, even at Jesus a little bit, because we identify so much with Martha. We've been Martha. We know her frustration, her exhaustion, her sense of being misunderstood. But that's exactly the time when we need to listen to the gospel the most. We need to hear what Jesus has to say, especially in those times when we desperately don't want to hear it. Because the story, Martha's story, flows from distraction to anxiety to grace. From distraction to anxiety to grace. And that grace is meant for you too. The gospel hones in on what causes anxiety in Martha. It doesn't beat around the bush. It tells us explicitly. And it tells us, too, what causes anxiety in our own lives as well. We are distracted. The Greek puts it very interestingly. It means we're literally pulled in every direction. And anyone who's been distracted knows that that's exactly how it feels. Like you're being spun around in a tornado and you don't know which way is which. When we feel distracted, it's like we're being drawn and quartered. So the real question for us is why? Why is it that we allow ourselves to feel this way when the gospel promises us release from this? And what was it here that made Martha allow herself to be distracted? To be distracted when her friends visit. To be distracted when the teacher, her rabbi, comes to visit. It's this. Martha was focused more on herself than her guests. Oh, sure, she used her guests as an excuse. But in reality, the story had Martha at the center. She thought of her guests as people she had to prove herself to, instead of people who had set aside time to be with her. So she focused on all the little things that would make her look good to them, instead of just being with Jesus. Maybe this happens to you as well. I know it sure happens to me. Maybe it happens with you in your time with Jesus, as you think of all the things you could do to make Jesus impressed with you, instead of just allowing yourself to be loved by him. That's the greatest scandal in the church, isn't it? How we focus on our love, our work for Jesus, instead of listening to Him. Really listening to Him. Understanding that just as Martha didn't run out and tell Him, "Come to my church, my house," we instead have to understand that Jesus shows up and promises to come to be in our lives, in our houses, in our church. Martha's distracted focus was creating what we might call spiritual noise, the internal uproar of anxieties that drown out the deep signal, the message, the word that Jesus is present in our lives, even in the midst of our distractions. We all know how hard it is to hear someone talking when there's a lot of racket going on. We've all gone to those restaurants or been at those parties. It's hard to hear that one voice when there's so much noise begging for our attention, or just blathering in the background. And that's what's happened to the spirit of Martha here. She allowed her work to take precedence over her relationships. Her anxiety was making so much internal noise that she couldn't hear Jesus' voice of love, even though He was sitting there right in the living room. I tell you what, that's how my prayer time feels. It's hard to just listen to God in the midst of our prayers, because pretty soon all those little anxious distractions start popping up, pinging like social media messages. And so in this moment of intense emotion, Martha lashes out at Jesus and Mary because they don't seem to understand her distress as she wants to understand it. It's important to notice what happens next. We must actually listen to what the gospel is saying. Jesus doesn't make things worse by getting defensive or angry with Martha. But He also doesn't just brush off her concerns with empty promises and reassurances. Instead, He looks at Martha. And what's interesting is Martha hasn't really been looking at herself this entire time, has she? He sees Martha not as she wishes to present herself in any given moment, but sees what's really going on with her. He sees her in her messiness. He sees her in her disorientation. He sees her in her anxiety. And He loves her. Jesus sees you in your messiness. He sees you in your disorganization. He sees you in your disorientation. He sees you in your anxiety. He sees you at your worst. He sees you when you don't want anyone to look at you, and He still loves you. All this clutter in our lives, all this messiness that we desperately try to shove into the corner when Jesus arrives, He knows about it. But He's too busy trying to be with us, to be present, to stop loving you until you practice good housekeeping. His love doesn't depend on your housekeeping. Martha's work didn't come from loving God, and that's the problem with this passage. This is what we miss in this passage. It doesn't come from loving God. It doesn't come from loving neighbor, which, by the way, is the immediate passage just preceding this one. It came from loving her own image. how she thought she needed to appear to be worthy of Jesus' love, affection, and priority. Jesus cuts through the noise in her heart with a gentle Martha, Martha. And at that moment, you can almost hear her fears and anxieties melt away as they move down further and further to the bottom of the priorities list. I heard someone put it this way: Martha got confused about who was hosting whom. She thought she was the one serving Jesus, but Jesus has come to serve her. Do we sometimes do that in church? Do we sometimes worry that church is more about trying to look good to God and to neighbor than it is to receiving God's presence in our lives? So much so that we actually keep God's presence at arm's length because we're too busy trying to appear lovable that we forget to be loved in the first place. Well, it's in this way that Jesus was telling Martha that Mary and his disciples were allowing Jesus to serve as the host. Think about it. Martha had what every Christian since then has dreamed of having. Jesus was right there, present in her living room, and she was too busy in the kitchen to enjoy it. You and I know two things. First, we would say, I would never do that. I would never ignore Jesus because I was too busy or distracted. And secondly, you know, just like I know, that we do it all the time. And that's why we need to listen. To do what Jesus says. To listen at his feet and hear him speak to us. Speak to us in word and sacrament, in private prayer and in corporate worship, in quiet kitchens and around the dinner table. We need to hear him call our name and know that he is right here with us. This isn't the story of lazy Martha or lazy Mary and good old reliable Martha. It's not a story of dutiful Martha and starry-eyed Mary. This is the story of what matters most when Jesus enters your home, when Jesus enters your life. We can let the distractions and anxieties of life become our master, or we can let grace remind us, just as it reminded Martha, of what is truly the most important thing, what is the better portion of our lives. If anything, the temptation of Martha has become even more pressing in our present day. We have new devices that seem to crowd things out and new obligations populating our calendars. It's hard to find time. It's hard to make time to sit at the Master's feet. And if it is hard for those of us inside the church, just imagine how much harder it is for people outside the church who don't know that Jesus Christ is right at the door knocking, asking to come in. We're sitting in the midst of their lives, amidst the distractions and messiness and disorientation and anxieties. And so you and I need to do the better thing, to choose the better portion. We need to tell them that our God is a God who doesn't require an apology, that the house is a bit messy. The better portion is just to welcome him in. Amen.